Even in the darkest soil, the most beautiful stories can bloom. Witness the triumph of the human spirit over adversity in our latest collection of cinematic and emotional narratives. Subscribe today to watch beauty emerge from the shadows of life.
My brother-in-law stood at the head of the dining room table, adjusting his cufflinks with the particular kind of confidence that only comes from a lifetime of being everyone's favorite. The family attorney had barely finished arranging his papers when my brother-in-law slid a folder across the polished mahogany toward my husband and said, quietly enough that only those closest could hear, "There's something you need to see before we sign anything today. Something about your wife." I looked up from where I stood near the window, our guests frozen mid-conversation around us. My husband's parents, his aunts, the two family friends who had witnessed every milestone of the Hargrove name for 30 years. All of them were about to hear whatever my brother-in-law had prepared. I could see the folder from across the room. I recognized the logo on the tab. I had put it there myself. I smiled, set down my glass, and walked toward the table. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is for people who believe that the truth, however inconvenient, is always worth protecting. Today's story is about what happens when a family estate signing becomes the moment an entire decade of deception finally unravels. Stay with me. My husband Daniel and I met 11 years ago at a fundraiser for a children's hospital in Chicago. He was a pediatric cardiologist finishing his fellowship. I was a corporate attorney who had just made partner at 32. We were introduced by his mother, which I later learned was not accidental. She had, in her words, been watching me handle a contract dispute at a charity board meeting and decided I was exactly the kind of woman her son needed. I don't know whether to call that flattering or alarming. Probably both. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony at the Hargrove family property in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, a 19th century lake house that had been in the family for 4 generations. Daniel's father, Gerald, had spent his career building a regional hospital network that his own father had founded. The Hargrove name in the medical community carried the kind of weight that doesn't come from money alone. It comes from decades of specific decisions made by specific people under pressure. Gerald was that kind of man. His older son, Ryan, was not. Ryan Hargrove was 44 when all of this happened. Charming in the way that people are charming when they have learned early that charm is a tool. He had worked in hospital administration for most of his career, always adjacent to the real work, always in rooms where decisions were made by others. He had been married to a woman named Nicole for 9 years. She was slim, polished, and laughed at exactly the right moments. I had never entirely trusted either of them, but I want to be precise about that. I didn't distrust them because of anything I could point to. It was more like the feeling you get when a contract is worded just slightly more carefully than it needs to be. The estate signing had been scheduled for months. Gerald had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's the previous winter, and his attorney had advised him to begin organizing the formal transfer of assets while his cognizance was fully intact and legally unimpeachable. The Hargrove estate was substantial. The Lake Geneva property, 2 medical buildings, a portfolio of hospital system equity, and a foundation endowment. Gerald had always been clear, privately, that he intended the operational assets to go to Daniel, who had dedicated his career to medicine the way Gerald had. Ryan would receive the Lake Geneva property and a generous cash settlement. It wasn't equal, it was intentional. Ryan had known this for years. What I did not know, until 4 months before the signing, was how far he had been willing to go to change it. It started with a phone call I was not supposed to receive. I had borrowed Daniel's cell phone one evening because mine was charging in the other room and a voicemail notification appeared from a number I didn't recognize. I wouldn't normally have opened it, but the contact name stored in Daniel's phone simply read, "Don't call back," and something about that phrasing made me pause. The voicemail was from Ryan. His voice was careful, measured, the way people speak when they know they are choosing words that might be repeated. He said that the situation with the child needed to be resolved before the signing. He said that if Daniel didn't make it right with Nicole, he would have no choice but to bring the documentation to the table himself. I sat in our kitchen for a long time after that. I want to be clear about what I did next. I did not confront Daniel, not that night, not for 2 weeks. Because I have spent my career in litigation, and I understand the difference between suspicion and evidence. What I had was a voicemail that could mean several things. What I needed was to know which thing it meant before I said a word to anyone. I called a colleague the next morning, a private investigator named Marcus Webb, who had consulted on several of my firm's cases. I had referred him enough business over the years that he owed me a professional favor, and I called it in. I told him I needed to know the nature of any relationship, past or present, between my sister-in-law Nicole and my husband. I told him I needed financial records, communication records, and anything involving the phrase, the child. Then I went back to work and waited. Marcus came back to me in 3 weeks. He sat across from me in my office, closed the door, and put a folder on my desk. He said before I opened it that nothing inside involved my husband. I remember the specific relief of that sentence, the way it landed before I had even processed what it meant for everything else. The child in question was a 6-year-old boy named Eli. His mother was a woman named Cassandra Reeves, who had worked as an administrative coordinator at one of the Hargrove medical buildings 4 years before I had ever met anyone in this family. The boy had been born 7 years ago. The DNA documentation in Marcus's folder showed, with the kind of precision that does not leave room for interpretation, that his father was Ryan Hargrove. Ryan and Nicole did not have children. They had told the family for years that they had chosen not to. What they had not told the family was that Ryan had a son living 40 minutes away in Kenosha, being raised by his mother with the assistance of irregular wire transfers from an account Nicole did not know about, until at some point in the past 18 months, she did. The second document in Marcus's folder was more difficult to read. Nicole had discovered Eli's existence approximately 14 months earlier. Rather than leaving her marriage, she had made a different calculation. She had approached Cassandra Reeves directly. What passed between them, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that within 6 weeks of that meeting, a new piece of documentation appeared. A letter on what appeared to be hospital stationery, signed by a physician whose license had been suspended 2 years prior, suggesting that Daniel Hargrove had been involved in a romantic relationship with a former patient's family member and that a child may have resulted. The letter was vague in the way that effective lies are vague, specific enough to be alarming, ambiguous enough to be difficult to disprove. Ryan had been sitting on this letter for over a year, waiting for the right moment. The estate signing was the right moment. My father-in-law did not know any of this. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, was a different matter. I had always found Eleanor Hargrove harder to read than her husband. She was gracious, intelligent, and said less than she knew in every conversation. After Marcus gave me his report, I asked to meet her for lunch alone. Just the two of us. No husbands, no occasion. I told her I needed to talk about something before the signing and that I needed her to be honest with me. She arrived at the restaurant already knowing something was wrong. We sat for a while before either of us addressed it directly. She ordered sparkling water and didn't drink it. I watched her hands on the table, still controlled. Then she said, without my prompting, I've been worried about Ryan for a long time. Not about what he's done, about what he's capable of deciding is justified. I told her what Marcus had found. Eleanor did not look surprised. She looked instead like someone who had just seen a shape they had been sensing in the dark finally step into the light. She pressed her lips together and was quiet for a moment. Then she said that 2 years ago, before Gerald's diagnosis, she had found a draft document on Ryan's laptop when she had borrowed it to print a boarding pass. The document was a proposed revision to Gerald's estate plan, written in Ryan's handwriting, reassigning the medical building equity. She had confronted Ryan. He had told her she had misunderstood what she was looking at. She had let herself believe him because the alternative was something she wasn't ready to hold. She was ready now. I laid out what I needed her to do. She agreed without hesitation. The day of the signing, the Hargrove dining room was set with the formality that Gerald preferred for occasions of significance. The family attorney, a man named Paul Whitfield who had known Gerald for 30 years, sat at one end of the table. Gerald and Eleanor sat together. Daniel was beside me. Ryan and Nicole arrived last. Ryan's hand at the small of Nicole's back. His expression calibrated to project the relaxed confidence of someone who believes the outcome is already decided. Paul had barely finished his preliminary remarks when Ryan reached into his jacket and withdrew the folder. He placed it on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed the gesture. He said he was sorry to raise something difficult at this moment, but that he had a responsibility to the family to share documentation that called into question whether Daniel's marriage and household represented the kind of stability the estate transfer required. He slid the folder toward Gerald. I said, before you open that, I want you to know that I've already seen it, and I'd like to tell you where it came from. The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when everyone realizes the script is changed. I had prepared my own folder. I had brought 3 copies, as I do in every proceeding where I expect resistance. I placed one in front of Gerald, one in front of Paul Whitfield, and I kept one for myself. I walked them through it the way I would walk a jury through a timeline, not quickly, not emotionally, just in order. First, Marcus's documentation of Eli Hargrove Reeves, age 7, residing in Kenosha. DNA confirmation. Ryan's financial transfer records spanning 6 years, routed through a subsidiary account. The dates, the amounts, the pattern of payments that accelerated precisely when Gerald's diagnosis was announced. Second, the suspended physician's letter, along with Marcus's documentation of when and how it had been generated, the physician's license status, and a signed statement from Cassandra Reeves herself explaining the approach Nicole had made and what had been asked of her. Cassandra had agreed to provide that statement when Marcus explained what the letter was being used for. She had a son. She understood what it meant to protect a child from adults making bad decisions. Third, a printout of the draft estate revision Eleanor had found on Ryan's laptop 2 years prior, which she had, it turned out, photographed before she closed the browser. She had kept it on an old phone in the back of a drawer, the way people keep things they aren't ready to use, but aren't ready to discard either. Nicole's composure held for approximately 90 seconds. Then she stood up and said that she had not known what Ryan intended to do with the letter. She said she had found the documentation and given it to him, and that she had believed it was real. Ryan said, "Nicole." She sat back down and didn't look at him again. Gerald had not spoken. He was reading my folder with the attention of a man who has spent his life understanding that the hardest documents to read are the ones that require you to revise something you thought you knew. His hands were steadier than I expected. He turned to Ryan when he finished, and what he said was not loud. It was precise. He said, "You used a child, your own son, who you have never acknowledged, to manufacture a lie about your brother, and you expected me to sign a different estate plan on the basis of that lie." Ryan started to say something about the complexity of his situation, about how long he had been overlooked, about what it had felt like to watch Daniel receive what Ryan called every benefit of every doubt for their entire lives. Some of what he said was probably even true. Resentment that old rarely grows from nothing. Gerald raised one hand, and Ryan stopped. Eleanor spoke then, which I had not anticipated. She addressed Ryan calmly and told him that she had watched him grow up feeling like the margin of this family, and that she was sorry she had not done more to change that. She also told him that she had photographed that document 2 years ago because some part of her had known this moment was coming, and she had wanted to be ready to protect Daniel when it did. She said she was sorry it had taken this long. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard her say. Paul Whitfield recommended we pause the proceeding. We reconvened 3 weeks later, after Ryan had retained his own attorney, after Nicole had moved into a hotel, and after Cassandra Reeves had been contacted by the Hargrove family attorney directly regarding formal acknowledgement of Eli and appropriate financial arrangements that did not route through deception. The estate transfer proceeded substantially as Gerald had originally intended. Ryan's settlement was reduced to account for the 6 years of family funds that had been quietly redirected. His attorney negotiated. Paul Whitfield held firm. Gerald signed. The hardest part was not the legal proceeding. The hardest part was the conversation Daniel and I had the night after the first meeting, when the house was quiet and he was sitting at the kitchen table reading through everything Marcus had documented. He asked me how long I had known. I told him 4 months. He asked why I hadn't told him immediately. I thought about that carefully before I answered. I told him that I had needed to be certain before I said anything that would change how he saw his brother permanently. That once that kind of knowledge is spoken out loud between 2 people, it cannot be unspoken. I wanted to hand him the truth in a form he could hold, not a suspicion that would eat at him while we waited. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he understood. Then he said he wasn't sure he would have been capable of the same restraint. I told him I wasn't entirely sure I was capable of it either. That there had been nights in those 4 months when I had wanted to call Ryan and tell him I knew everything, just to stop carrying it alone. That the only thing that kept me disciplined was knowing that partial exposure gives the other side time to rebuild their story. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. Eli came to meet the Hargrove family for the first time 6 weeks after the signing. Cassandra drove him up from Kenosha on a Saturday afternoon in October. He was a quiet boy with his father's eyes and a manner that suggested he had learned early to observe a room before deciding what he thought of it. Gerald shook his hand formally, the way he greets everyone, and then, apparently without fully intending to, got down on one knee to be at the boy's eye level. Eleanor brought out a plate of the same sugar cookies she had made for Daniel and Ryan when they were children. Ryan was not there that day. He is still not a consistent presence in Eli's life, though the financial arrangements are now formal and documented. Whether that changes is a decision he will have to make for himself. Nicole filed for divorce 8 months after the signing. She and I are not close, but we have spoken twice since then, briefly and without hostility. She made choices I would not have made. She also found herself in a situation that had been constructed largely by someone else's deceptions, and she responded by making it worse. I understand both of those things without fully excusing either of them. Eleanor and I have dinner alone once a month now, the two of us, at the same restaurant where she told me she had been worried about what Ryan was capable of deciding was justified. We talk about Gerald's health, which is stable. We talk about Daniel. We talk occasionally about what it means to hold something difficult for a long time, because you love someone and you want to hand them the truth carefully. She told me once that she had underestimated me when Daniel first brought me home, that she had assumed I was primarily ambitious, which she said in the tone of someone who has reconsidered that assessment thoroughly. I told her that being primarily ambitious was not the worst thing she could have assumed. She laughed, which I had not heard her do unguardedly before. Gerald held a small dinner to mark the completion of the estate transfer, just family, the way he does things. He made a toast that was mostly about the hospital network and the decades of work that had gone into building it. Toward the end, he said something I have thought about many times since. He said that the people who protect the things that matter are not always the ones who built them. Sometimes they are the ones who married in, who have no obligation except the one they chose. He was looking at me when he said it. I have spent my career understanding that justice is not a feeling. It is a structure. You build it carefully. You document every beam. You do not place the final piece until you are certain the foundation will hold. What I had not understood until this family was that the structure you build is not just for the moment of confrontation. It is for everything that comes after. For the child in Kenosha who now has a name on a legal document. For the man who finds out his brother was willing to use a suspended physician's letter to take his inheritance. For the woman who photographed a screen 2 years ago and kept the image on an old phone just in case. Justice, when it is built correctly, does not just expose what was wrong. It creates the conditions for something more honest to exist in its place. We spent last Thanksgiving at the Lake Geneva property. Gerald sat by the window most of the afternoon, watching the water. Eli ran through the hallway with enough energy to rattle the picture frames, and Eleanor chased him without any of her usual composure, and looked entirely at peace about it. Daniel found me in the kitchen late in the evening after the others had gone to sleep. He said he had been thinking about something I told him the night of the signing, about carrying the truth carefully before handing it to someone. He said that was the thing he had come to understand about me that he hadn't, fully, before. I asked him what he meant. He said that most people, when they know something important, either say it too soon or hold it until it hardens into something they can't let go of. He said I had figured out that the right moment is neither of those. That it is the moment when the person receiving the truth has exactly what they need to do something with it. I told him I wasn't sure that was a skill. I thought it was more of a practice. Something you get wrong enough times that eventually you start to understand the shape of it. He said that was probably true of most things worth doing. Outside, the lake was dark and entirely still. Inside, someone had left a light on in the hallway, and the old house held around us the way places hold when they have finally been given back to the right people. I have thought about cause and consequence more times than I can count since everything in that dining room unfolded. Not in an abstract way, in the very specific way that you think about it when you have watched a person spend years constructing a false version of events and then seen that construction collapse under the weight of its own details. What Ryan built was not just a lie, it was a system. A forged letter, a hidden child used as leverage, a wife made complicit, a signing date chosen as the precise moment of maximum damage. That kind of architecture takes time. It takes calculation. And here is what I have come to understand about that level of sustained deception. It does not appear from nowhere. It is the end result of a long series of smaller choices, each one a little more dishonest than the last, each one teaching the person making it that the consequences can be managed. that no one is paying close enough attention, that the short-term gain is worth the long-term risk. By the time Ryan walked into that room with that folder, he had been practicing that logic for years. The final act was only possible because of every quiet compromise that preceded it. I am not saying this to excuse what he did. I am saying it because I think it matters to understand that integrity is not something you either have or don't have. It is something you practice or abandon incrementally in moments that feel small at the time. The choice to be honest, when dishonesty would be easier, is not a single heroic decision. It is a habit, built slowly out of hundreds of unremarkable moments that no one else will ever see or know about. What I practiced in those 4 months of investigation was restraint, not passivity. I want to be clear about that distinction. I was working the entire time, gathering, verifying, building the kind of structure that would hold under pressure. But I did not act until I was certain, and I did not speak until I had something worth saying. That discipline was not natural to me. I am, by training and by temperament, someone who moves quickly. What those 4 months taught me was that the timing of truth matters almost as much as the truth itself. Knowledge delivered too early without sufficient foundation gives the other side time to reframe it. Knowledge delivered at the right moment, in the right form, to the right people, that is what changes the structure of a situation permanently. The other thing I have thought about is Eleanor. She photographed that screen 2 years before any of this came to a head. She did not know when she would need it. She did not know if she ever would, but she kept it anyway, on a phone in the back of a drawer, because she understood that protecting the people you love sometimes means holding something difficult for a very long time without being able to explain why. That is its own kind of courage. It does not look like courage from the outside. It looks like an old phone. It looks like doing nothing. But it is in fact the very slow and very quiet work of someone who has decided that truth is worth the patience it requires. Ryan had a son he never acknowledged and a marriage he maintained through concealment. He had a family whose respect he wanted, and a character that made it impossible to earn honestly. Every year that passed without consequence taught him that the gap between who he was and who he appeared to be could be managed indefinitely. It could not. It never can. Not because the universe enforces a moral order, but because deception at that scale requires the cooperation of too many moving parts, and moving parts, eventually, move in directions you did not plan for. I did not set out to be the person who brought it down. I set out to protect my husband and our future. The exposure was a consequence of that, not the goal. I think that distinction matters. Justice pursued as revenge tends to calcify into something that damages the person pursuing it. Justice pursued as protection, of a child who deserved acknowledgement, of a man who deserved to inherit what his father intended, of a family that deserved to exist on honest terms, that is something you can carry without it becoming the thing that defines you. I am still a corporate attorney. Daniel is still a pediatric cardiologist. Eli is still a 7-year-old boy who runs through hallways and knocks things over. The lake is still there. That is what I wanted to protect. That is what I did.